Okay, I'm gonna get started. So I'm gonna let you guys self-introduce. So David, go ahead. Let's tell us about David and what's going on.
My name's Dave Duncan, and I'm president of the Grove Street Fire Safe Council. We just got our approved CWPP about a week or 10 days ago. So we're all ready to go and looking forward to starting various projects here in our council area. We started the process in July of 2019, had our first meeting, and got started in a way. And then in November, we got the great news that Fire Safe Sonoma was available to help us get our CWPP done and signed. So we started in November. We had an initial deadline of May 31st, but then COVID came along. So we got an extension, but despite COVID and everything else and not being able to have in-person meetings, we now have our CWPP all signed and ready to go. So that's our story.
Yes, awesome. And yeah, so David has a very fresh experience with crafting a CWPP. And Carleon has a long history of CWPPs, including 99.9% of the work on the very first and so far the only Sonoma County countywide CWPP. Carleon, tell us about you and what's going on in your world.
Needless to say, my world is crazy. And let's see, I've been doing this wildland urban interface stuff for about 20 years now in Sonoma County specifically, with both Fire Safe Sonoma and the County of Sonoma. I recently made a time commitment shift to a full-time position with Permit Sonoma, where I am a department analyst running several grants, which we have going, which are both implementation grants for dispensable space and structural hardening, and more cogent to this discussion, an update of the 2016 CWPP, which I wrote with a lot of help from Roberta. Thank you very much. The 2016 countywide CWPP, which you can see on Fire Safe Sonoma's website, was a project that was launched and run entirely by Fire Safe Sonoma. And that entire document was done on $20,000. And any of you who've ever written a large plan will know that that is not a lot of money to write a countywide plan. And the plan sort of reflects that. So this new version, which is going to become a very primary focus in my world in the next week, will have really greatly improved and more sophisticated mapping and modeling, which is one of, I think, the most important things that we really needed to circle up in the county so that we can more accurately determine where the areas of greatest risk are, what the most appropriate treatments are, how do we prioritize everybody's needs across the entire county, and get everybody on board with project prioritization and what we're doing how, so that we don't have competing processes and stuff like that, and really agree on what our priorities are as we move into a future which certainly looks like it's going to be increasingly characterized by large, devastating wildfires. This is not something that I think is going to change in our lifetimes, unfortunately. So it's a really good time to be moving forward. Local plans most likely will be annexed into the countywide plan, assuming that they meet a list of criteria to be developed. But the great thing about these local plans is that they pretty much guarantee that there is a lot of local participation, local stakeholder participation that went into those that may be more difficult to obtain in a large countywide process. So the plans in entirety, as well as details from the plans, will be important moving forward into the CWPP. And I'm really looking forward to being able to provide all of you out there who want to create new plans with the mapping and modeling data, which will help you make better plans and better determinations.
I imagine it evolving to a place where the county has the county-wide plan. And then if a local entity wants to craft a local CWPP, they almost literally, well, not literally, but hand in glove metaphorically, they fold into the county-wide plan. And in my perfect world, the county's plan will have systems in place that allow that relationship to occur just seamlessly and effortlessly and with support. So we'll see. There's a couple
And
places
being as Roberta is on the steering committee for the countywide plan, I'm thinking that should in fact take place.
Yeah, we'll try to influence it for sure. Okay, and then myself, my name of course is Roberta McIntyre. I'm the president and CEO of FireSafe Sonoma. Over 35 years of experience in the fire service. Started out as a volunteer firefighter in 1980 with the Roseland Fire Protection District, and then became a career firefighter with Santa Rosa, got into fire prevention, became an inspector, jumped from being a fire inspector over to the county as a county fire marshal and retired from there in 2015, but held on to my passion and interest in the fire service in the form of being involved with FireSafe Sonoma. And then Kaylin Notch, she is our brand new, almost brand new assistant to FireSafe Sonoma. She's a Civic Spark Fellow, and she's going to be helping FireSafe Sonoma with the law of the heavy lifting moving forward. So Kaylin, tell us a little bit about you, and then we'll get going.
Yeah, that was a great intro. Thanks, Roberta. You mentioned earlier that I'm splitting my time between FireSafe Sonoma and the Gold Ridge RCD. I don't have much more to add. This is wildfire prevention and outreach is a new field for me, so I'm learning as well through this webinar. So I'm excited to co-learn with all the attendees.
Yeah, and then once again, Kaylin's going to I'm basically calling her our producer or our moderator, facilitator, whatever for this webinar. She's going to handle the Q&A and toss the questions to the three of us panelists, David, Carleon, and myself, once we get to the Q&A period. So the incentive for communities to engage in forest planning really started back in 2003, thereabouts, with the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. And basically the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, they said that if you want federal money for projects related to the forest, particularly with fuels reduction and wildland fire management, I believe, if you want funding for those projects from the feds, you have to have a risk assessment developed in a particular format that they created, and they call it a Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And so as things evolved with various communities, particularly in California, I can't speak for other states, but in California in particular, we discovered that to get grant funding for projects related to wildland fire safety, education, fuels reduction, et cetera, you needed to have some kind of plan in place. If you go for a FEMA grant, FEMA says, well, before we're giving you any money, we want to see your plan. We want to see some risk assessment that objectively points to the fact that you need help in these specific areas. So as things evolved, what it turned out to, at least in my experience, is most folks use the Healthy Forest Restoration Act's model to create a CWPP and call it their risk assessment. So if you're applying for a FEMA grant and they say, hey, we want a risk assessment showing that these funds are appropriate for what you're asking for, and you have a CWPP, that works fine. Oftentimes with CAL FIRE grant funding or California Climates Initiative funding, they want to see that you have a local plan, often most times a CWPP in my experience. And then they also, most of the grantors want to have you also point to larger, more countywide plans like hazard mitigation plan and state fire strategic plans and things like that. But at the end of the day, most of us, when we do these plans, we fall on the industry standard of the Healthy Forest Act's criteria. And that's what this presentation is going to walk you through. The Healthy Forest Act, for Healthy Forest Restoration Act, their criteria for creating a CWPP. So some reasons for developing a CWPP include, fundamentally it outlines a plan to identify the risks in your community. We can all look around and go, gosh, we have a hard time evacuating. Well, let's objectively measure that, not just say we think so anecdotally or intuitively. Let's actually measure that and memorialize our results. So that's what you're doing. You're looking at the risks in your community as objectively as you can, and you're memorializing those risks. It also is an opportunity to establish really healthy relationships with your governmental partners. We call those, governmental stakeholders before an event occurs, and you get their feedback on your concepts and ideas as you move forward with crafting the plan. And one of the outgrowths can be, for example, a pre-attack plan or a WUI tactical map for line personnel to improve firefighter readiness and safety. Document planning and projects for garnering grant success. So a part of a CWPP based on the Healthy Forest Restoration Act criteria is that you have a list of projects, and married to those projects are conceptual mitigations. For example, you have identified a one-way main circulation road that goes in to serve the members of your community, and it's narrow and overgrown, and you want to improve that road to make it easier for fire resources to get in there and attack a fire, and also at the same time make it wide enough and healthy enough so that people can evacuate safely. So you memorialize that, you identify it, and you write it down. That will go into an appendix as a priority. You identify it as a low, medium, high priority using oftentimes those three criteria. You can go with 4 criteria, but you identify it as a priority, high, medium, or low. You rank it, and then you have it memorialized so that down the road when you want to do something about that risk, you can point to it to potential grantors and say, hey, this is what we need to do. We need this much money to pull this off. So that's the idea behind that. There's 3 minimum components of a CWPP based on the Healthy Forest Act criteria. It has to be collaborative, which means you involve governmental stakeholders and you involve community stakeholders. When we say governmental stakeholders, we're talking about state fire, we're talking about county government, we're talking about local fire, we're talking about parks and rec, governmental institutions, state parks, whoever, that fall under the umbrella of your community that you've identified within your boundary where you're going to do the plan, which is called the base map we'll talk about in a minute. The second element, also part of the collaboration, is community stakeholders. If you have a local business group, a business association, pull them in. If you've got a home builders group, pull them in. If you've got HOAs, homeowners associations, engage with them, and get them involved. That they need to have ownership in this, and you need to know what their concerns are. And then the second piece of the 3 components is prioritized fuel reduction. You really need to identify the fuels reduction element within the plan, particularly if you're using the Healthy Forest Restoration Act model. And then also you have to have the third element, and that's an element speaking to structural ignitability, the built environment within your community. How robust is it in terms of being able to withstand a significant wildfire event? And if it's at risk, then you identify ways to reduce that risk. David or Carleon, you want to weigh in on any of that at the moment? How am I doing? I guess we're okay. Oh,
There, now I'm not muted.
okay.
Sorry about that. In our experience, the collaborative aspect has been very important and very beneficial. We had a meeting with CAL FIRE, the Sheriff's Office. We've talked to Office of Emergency Services and our local, everyone from our local water board to our rec center to get their ideas about what we can do from their perspective and how we can work alongside them. So it's been a very important aspect of it. And as a guy who has had his own tax and accounting practice for 35 years, this notion of collaborating was a little foreign because I've been on my own, but it has been absolutely fantastic and helped us put together the plan that we have.
Yeah. Carleon, anything to add, or should I move forward?
No, I just think that, I'll throw in there that so many of the communities have done these have really had the experience that David just alluded to, which is that it's a really great, most OQ folks out there in the world really don't understand how agencies work together. What's the difference between a state firefighter and a local firefighter? And how does that affect me and my community? Are my local firefighters volunteers, or are they paid? What's the difference there, if any? And so it's a really good opportunity to learn some really basic and very important things about how your community works. And then the other thing, in the 3 priorities, my own personal horse that I like to whip the most is the concept of structure hardening, which is something that is still really, I don't think has become as integral to our thinking about fire hazard as it really needs to be. But this is a message that I really hope that through the course of doing the CWPP, everybody who's working on your plan will really gain a much better understanding about what structure hardening is and why it's important, and help spread the word about that to the community as a whole. Because it is critically important, and as we're seeing these very large landscape scale fires, I think there's increasing concern about doing treatments in the forest that may or may not really be effective at the end of the day. So I really hope that that's one of the things that comes out of the process.
Yeah, and I totally agree with Carleon on that point, and not to belabor it in the interest of staying on task, I will mention that I just finished reviewing a report done using all the data that was collected over the last 5 years in the recent phenomenal fires we've had in the western states. And my analysis of that report is, at the end of the day, structural hardening reduces your risk more than defensible space. So I'll leave it at that. But the key, really, I think Carleon, hit the nail on the head, and structural hardening is incredibly important. And I think that's why the Healthy Forest Act called, structural hardening, is how I'll describe it, into the plan development. That wasn't always in there, I don't think. And we've all recognized the importance of that, so it's in there. Okay. With regard to collaborators, let me go back one. I think that slide was just reinforcing what I already said earlier. So you want to involve local government, local fire, CAL FIRE. And then also, if you've already done a plan, you don't need to do another one. CWPP's, the narrative element of the plan is meant to have a long life, but the appendices to the plan are meant to be updated. So for example, your project, your list of projects goes in as an appendix, and that should be updated annually as things change. If you complete a project, take it off the list. You may discover other risks, you know, that you want to add other projects to the list, etc. So, with regard to your collaborators, I look at the people you're engaging with as stakeholders and shareholders. The stakeholders, and I'm using that term a lot as I do these plans and work with people. I look at a stakeholder as those people who are providing input into the effort. They're helping to make the thing that you're making, the plan, in some way, shape, or form. And the shareholders, that's the community that benefits from the plan long term. They may or may not have had an input on the development of the plan, but they are the benefactors of all your hard work. So if I live in an area where they did a plan and all of a sudden, you know, all these projects are being done, then as a shareholder, I benefit from that plan. So that's just a terminology thing I throw out there. The benefits to communities in terms of having a CWPP, you know, part of the CWPP identifies your area that you're encompassing in your base map as a wildland urban interface zone. And in the absence of that, you know, the A definition of a wildland urban interface area is half a mile of community's boundary, or within a mile and a half, et cetera, et cetera. Technically, that's the definition. The other part is if you know, you're along evacuation routes, with regard to field treatment, that still can be considered a WUI in terms of putting effort towards a risk reduction.
And if I could
Yeah.
jump in for a second on the definition of the WUI. In the original version of the Sonoma County CWPP, what we attempted to do was say that everything that is state responsibility area, which not quite, this isn't quite correct, but it's almost correct, is everything outside of municipalities, right? So we have your Santa Rosa is a municipality, Healdsburg, Roanoke Park, and everything that's outside of there in Sonoma County is called the state responsibility area, SRA, as opposed to the LRA, or municipalities. And what we did in the original 2016 plan was said that all of the SRA is considered to be wildland urban interface or intermix. And the difference between those terms is primarily it's about density. Interface is, say, Oakmont is a really good example of interface, wildland urban interface, because you have a dense housing community immediately abutting a large wildland area. If you look at my screensaver photo back there, that's literally my backyard, which looks different now than it did a month ago, by the way. This is intermixed because there's much that's houses spread throughout the area on very few homes per acre. CAL FIRE did not want to determine that this area that I live in is WUI, which I have some objection about. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion when we come to the countywide plan, because we did have to change it in the 2016 version, but that designation of the WUI is important. And I'm guessing that most of you who are on this call are in WUI communities more than intermixed communities like mine, but it's an important thing to start thinking about and moving forward with.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. The development of a plan doesn't have to be terribly complex. I think the most complex part is the collaboration part. If it wasn't for the collaboration part, I think that a well-informed individual could complete a CWPP from their desk. You know, and that's, you know, not necessarily true, but, you know, but conceivably you could. But it does need to be collaborative. Like I say, that's probably the most complex part of it. It does have to address core elements of community protection, fuels reduction, and structural ignition. We talked about those two elements already. You can also go beyond that. In recent plans, we've pulled in early notification and evacuation as part of, you know, things that are concerns of the community that get pulled in. You know, we consider those core elements as well. The plan needs to embrace meaningful discussion among your community members. Once again, that's collaboration. You have to, you know, engage with folks and learn what's important. You know, I like to give the example of, you know, you don't know what you don't know until you start engaging with folks. You know, you might start to have these meetings and start talking about, okay, what are risks? And that clearly there are the built environment risks, there are the egress route risks, there's a life safety risk, etc. But I think sometimes, you know, unless you've got a long-term resident of the community, you forget about things like cultural risks. You know, what about, you know, the graveyard that's over here that's been here forever? What about the statue of so-and-so that's been in town forever? So things like that that are really hard to call a risk using objective systems or tools. You know, when it comes to things like that, you really need to have the community involvement to say, oh, but this is important too, so we want to include that. So there is a degree of subjectivity, but that comes into play with the local collaboration. So it's an 8-step process, and it involves, you know, convening the core team, engaging your governmental stakeholders, engaging your community stakeholders, the establishment of a base map, conducting a risk assessment, and then identifying the priorities based on all of the upstream dialogue and discussion. And then you develop the draft plan, get feedback on it, and then you finalize the plan. So we're going to walk through those 8 steps here. So convening the decision makers. You really need some champions here. And ideally, you need champions that are in it for the long haul. If you're a community that has a local group, like a, you know, COPE group or a CERT group even could work. A Fire Safe Council is ideal for this. You know, an HOA could probably do a plan, but you need a group of people that are there that can champion this process. It's not an easy process. It's even though the last slide said it's not complex or doesn't have to be, it is time consuming. It takes a lot of work and a lot of engagement. I would give yourself, if you're doing a plan, I would give yourself between 6 months to a year to craft it and to do it well. Though, like I said, we started the ones for Grove Street and Occidental in November, and we're just finishing up that. But part of that, you know, was the fact that we got slowed down a little bit because of COVID, et cetera. But it does take time, and it does take money. And, you know, you have to have a cartographer making maps. You have to have a facilitator ideally managing the meetings. If you have that resource within your team, then great, you could save those costs. But if you don't, you'll have to outsource those tasks and other tasks. Within your core team, ideally you want to have representation from government entities. Make sure you have somebody from CAL FIRE attending your meetings as much as possible, or at least sharing their ideas with you remotely via emails, multimedia meetings, conferencing, whatever. Engage with those folks. Engage with your government officials. Engage with all the folks. Keep them engaged.
And if I can jump in, in addition to CAL FIRE, you'll definitely want to have your local fire department involved as well.
Have to. Yeah.
There's a local fire department who is usually the first on scene at any incident. But CAL FIRE in any area that's state responsibility area, they're the ones ultimately who are in charge of prevention and suppression in the county. So you have to have both your local folks who are going to be your go-to guys a lot of the time as well, and CAL FIRE. So you need to make sure and engage both of those guys. And a quick word about engaging your local fire dudes. Timing is everything, and trying to do the process like at this time of year, you're going to have a really hard time engaging your fire dudes because they're all so crazy busy. So think about when you want to launch the process in terms of the degree to which they can be involved.
That's a really good point, Carleon, because like David, you know, we started working with you in November, and if it wasn't for COVID, we would have been finished just in front of the summer months when we started really getting the busy fire stuff going on.
And I would like we took a little different approach when we knew we wanted to, I and a couple of other people knew that we wanted to get a fire safe council going and do a CWPP. We have a very great neighborhood here of people who are absolutely interested in this. And we have people who have experience working with the county on road repairs. We have one guy in particular, he's been here for a long time. He knows every parcel in this area. And I always joke that he knows what color toilet paper people use because he knows the whole history. We have, I'm a volunteer firefighter. I got the other two volunteer firefighters who live up here to be on our board. I wanted the technical expertise, and I also wanted the skills that we would need to implement. We've got two engineers, retired engineers, so they've got, and one of the volunteer firefighters also worked for Caltrans as an engineer for their project. So you want to look for people, if you can do it, get people who have the skill sets that you'll need both to do the CWPP and then start implementing projects, because there are a lot of functions that need to be carried out. And if you've got people who have professional experience in them, you're all the better.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right. And then I would suggest too, you know, you find those people with those skill sets and assign them relevant tasks. And this is kind of like a hierarchy I created when we're working on the two that I mentioned. So Fire Safe Council is a facilitator in that case, or was. And so that was me. And I didn't want to be working with everybody. Remember the, you know, management, you know, let's see, span of control is, you know, ideally 5 to 1, you know, so no more than managing 5 people or 5 things at one time for a manager is ideal. And so with that said, so if you have like, you know, whoever's the overall management of it, oftentimes it's Fire Safe Sonoma if we're helping out with it. And then we interact with the cartographer, the map maker. We interact with governmental stakeholders and get them the meetings, et cetera, because we have those connections and that influence oftentimes. Community stakeholders will engage with the ones we know. And then mostly we're working with the development team leader, like for Grove Street, David Duncan was the development team leader. So I was working directly with David, and then David was working with his, you know, project managers. So he was working with the woman who was writing the chapter, the introduction chapter, and the person writing the community overview section. And one of his guys is a local volunteer firefighter as well. So he was working on the firefighter capacity capability chapter and getting that information. So if you assign a person who's got a matching skill set to each of these tasks that need to be accomplished, and then they report to the team leader, and the team leader works with whoever has the primary oversight for the project development, it works really well. That's not to say that these other entities don't get tasked with interacting with various other elements, but it's just good to have that span of control for management of the project. don't let it go sideways, because it could go sideways in a heartbeat, and you don't want to be trying to talk to 100 different people and trying to manage that. Just keep your span of control manageable. So when you convene, that first meeting, you first convene your development team, figure out who's on the development team. And then that development team, those champions, will then identify, okay, who's important in terms of our governmental and community stakeholders to engage with. Depending on and what's our base map going to be? You start asking the question, what is our base map? Are we going to follow a natural geopolitical boundary like a fire district? Or are we going to just carve out an area for our neighborhood? Or what? Are we going to use a supervisoral district? What is going to be our base map footprint? You start thinking about that, and at some point you will memorialize that base map. But think about who you're going to engage with. If you don't have any parks in your base map, state or county, then you probably don't need to engage with Parks and Recreation. So this is just kind of giving you an idea of who to engage with.
Hey, Roberta.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You threw out some acronyms that I feel like might be helpful to define. You mentioned COPE and CIRC.
Yeah.
What does that stand for?
Yeah. COPE, it looks like you clarified COPE already. Thank you. Or somebody did.
There you go.
Yeah. And CERT is Community Emergency Response Teams. And there are different types or different forms of CERT teams. There's San Francisco uses NERT, and it's basically a community organization to respond during emergencies. COPE is a kind of a like CERT light, if you will. They don't get involved in a lot of the hands-on rescue and stuff like that, like a CERT team does, but they do help their neighborhoods get prepared. There's one that Sebastopol does, Map My Neighborhood, that seems to be gaining traction, at least that model, all over, which I think is good. And it's sort of like COPE, you figure out who your neighbors are, et cetera. But in terms of acronyms, what other acronyms have I tossed out that I need to clarify? If any come up,
those are the two I remember.
Okay, if any come up, and thanks, I'll try to be clear about that moving forward. So let's see. So once again, yeah, the core team should engage local representatives. It is a collaborative process. And then you engage interested parties. So there's a distinction between governmental stakeholders and community stakeholders. And ideally, let me back up. So when you do that, once you've established your core team, you've got your 5 or 6 champions, then you hold your first public meeting, which typically is your governmental stakeholder meeting. And that's where you invite your governmental representatives, your local and state fire people, your parks people, your fish and wildlife people, those folks, the governmental horsepower you want in the room. And you say, hey, here's what we're looking at. Here's where we're thinking our base map wants to be. And we're letting you know, first off, that we're doing this. We want to make sure it folds into any other plans that we all have in the county or locally. And we want to make sure that we're engaging with you guys. What do you think? Anything to offer? So on and so forth. So you want to have that exchange. After that meeting, you become informed in terms of steps to take moving forward, and you start to get the data you need to start crafting the document and making decisions moving forward. At that first meeting, one of the governmental entities might say, well, this is such and such and that's such and such. You may want to think about making your base map this because it follows this boundary that you didn't know about or forgot about or whatever. So you never know what people are going to come up with until you engage with them. I used to teach for the junior college in the fire tech program, and one of the things I would tell early on in the semester, I'd tell the students, I'd tell them, I'm not the smartest person in this room. And I know I'm going to cover topics that some of you know more about than I do. And if that's the case, please share with me what you know, because I don't know everything about anything, and little about something, most things. So, if you know a lot about something that I'm covering, please share. And that's the concept here, get people who know about things to engage and help you become informed. Uh, so, okay, and then the second big meeting is I call it the community stakeholder meeting, where you invite your representatives from your homeowners associations, or, if you got a Boy Scout chapter, invite them. In Occidental, they have a unique situation where there are a lot of campgrounds and retreats out in that area, Occidental and Camp Meeker area. So, and Camp Meeker is going through the CWPP development process as we speak. Carleon's helping to champion that one. And we had a joint meeting with Camp Meeker and the Occidental core group, CWPP groups, and invited all the folks who own and manage the camps out in that area to a meeting to talk specifically about what is unique to the camps that we need to consider. What are your evacuation issues? What are your fuels reduction issues? How can we get informed about that to fold that into the plans? So that's an example on how to do that. Once again, you don't know what you don't know. So it's important to engage. And then step 4 is to sit down as a group with the information you've garnered thus far and establish your base map. So you make that initial footprint. And then as things move forward within that footprint, you're going to identify assets at risk. And an asset could be something like a school. An asset could be something like a cultural resource. An asset could be something like a neighborhood that's unique, has unique characteristics, or a group of neighborhoods. An asset can be a utility infrastructure. Things like that are assets that you want to identify. And moving forward, once you identify those assets, then you'll apply an objective risk analysis to those assets to determine their wildland risk, and all that folds into the overall plan. Let's see. Yeah, so that's and also you're identifying that as your preliminary designation of the community's WUI zone, wildland urban interface zone. So you've done that, you've identified your base map, you started to look at your communities at risk within the base map. So these are things that you need to measure as you're doing your risk assessment. So you have a big meeting, risk assessment. I do want to let you know, I shared in the chat earlier links to resources. One of those links includes a risk assessment tool that was developed through grant funding we received for a project that Carleon championed to craft this tool, and it's working really well. We use this tool in at least 5 or 6 of the most recent CWPPs we've done. We've done Fitch Mountain with the, help me out here, Carleon. With that tool, we did Fitch Mountain, we did Fort Ross area, we did Bennett Ridge or Bennett Valley, we did Grove Street, Occidental, Mill Creek. I know of those 6 for sure where we use the risk assessment tool. And it works really well to establish the level of risk. And at the end of the analysis, it'll show you areas where you're in need of work. You might discover that, oh my gosh, we need to improve our water infrastructure. We don't have enough water for firefighting, or we have issues with bridges, or we have too many dead-end roads, or whatever. Some of those things you can do things about. Some of those things you just have to accept and try to mitigate in some other way. But the things that are measured are your fuel hazards, your risk of wildfire occurrence using historical data. You do some historical research. For fuel hazards, you look at the degree of fuels buildup in the area using vegetation maps, types of vegetation, things like that. You look at the fire hazard severity zone maps, pull that information in. And then for your risk of wildfire occurrence, you use the CAL FIRE's fire risk maps, communities at risk information. Oftentimes in Sonoma County, I mean, I think we have more technically, I think in Sonoma County, technically, we have more communities at risk than people realize as identified by CAL FIRE. Historical data folds in. Then you look at, like I mentioned earlier, your assets at risk, homes, businesses, essential infrastructure. And when I say businesses, I don't mean, businesses that people work out of the home, contractors, things like that. When I think of businesses, I think of businesses large enough to have adverse impact on commerce within your community or beyond. So using an extreme example, if your community has, Google in your community, if Google burned down because of a wildland fire and went away, that would have a significant impact on your community. With Occidental, we looked at tourism. If something happened to some of the businesses downtown, if the downtown area went away, that would have a significant monetary adverse impact to the community. Other community values, as I mentioned, we have wildlife habitat, of course, scenic areas, some vegetation is important to keep and manage. And some things are of cultural value. You might have an area with Native American artifacts, things like that. And then you have to interact with your fire folks and determine what their firefighting capabilities are, in particular relative to the wildland fire safety element. David or Carleon, anything to add or chime in? Okay, and then folks listening in, don't forget, if you have a question that comes up, don't hold on to it and wait till the end and try to remember to ask it. Just go ahead and put it in the Q&A as soon as you think of it, and then we'll get to it. So, okay. So then step 5 is to do the risk assessment. So you take those areas within your community that have unique characteristics enough to where you've identified them as separate entities, and then you measure those risks. So over here, maybe you have a school with a moderate risk. Here you have a downtown area, maybe it's just a high risk. Over here you've got a community, an area of homes that are all one way in, one way out, heavily forested area, might be a high risk. Over here, you might have a little subdivision that has, hydrants and underground power lines, and it's a relatively modern, with modern construction. It might be a low risk. And over here, you might have some pre-2008 buildings, and also, extreme risk for whatever reason. Might be a cultural risk out here, that you want to protect. So you identify those areas, then you measure them, and you do a risk assessment for each of those. And then you do a risk assessment, a global risk assessment for the entire base map area. And now that you're up to step 5, you have ideally somebody who started writing the, maybe not the introduction. Oftentimes you want to write the introduction last, but you've got somebody who's already, written or researched the community profile element. And you've got folks, looking at the structural ignitability of the area. Most of your homes built pre-2003. That's a threshold you want to look at, things like that. Do most of them have wood roofs, or are they, fire resistant roofs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a person working on that. So getting to step 5, ideally, you're not just sitting on your hands, until now, you've already got your subject matter experts from the core team working on those and are already crafting drafts of the narrative that's going to be pulled together a little bit later. So then as you conduct the community risk assessment, and these things are pulled into also the tool that I mentioned that Carleon helped to develop. You look at the field conditions for influencing wildfire risk. How close are the houses? Do they have defensible space? Are there open spaces? How much fuel is there? Do you have sudden oak death, SOD in your area? That might be something you want to tackle. Drought, well, we're all experiencing a lot of drought in recent years in our area. These are things, the arrangement of field, species, what kind of vegetation is there. So these and more are elements that are pulled into the risk assessment. History, wildfire history is considered, as we mentioned before. Do you have a history? And I oftentimes wonder about the history of, and how this really relates to the big picture. If you haven't had a fire in a very long time, is that good? Because, you live in an area that's relatively safe from fire? Or is that bad because your number just hasn't come up yet? It's like the guy that jumps off the airplane, it's good that he jumps out and his parachute opens, but that one time it doesn't open, it's a bad time. So, I'm not sure if that's the best analogy, probably not. But regardless, you look at the history of fires in your area. From stuff that I've looked at recently, West Sonoma County, they're up. We've already seen that in recent months. I think that I am very worried about West County right now, based on historical fires that we've had, and comparing the history with what's going on now and what's happened in the last couple of years. You do the risk assessment. I mentioned the tool you use, other things to consider, special populations, utilities, cultural assets, all other infrastructure. That all gets folded in. And, I think I covered all this already off that one slide, but, the other things to consider.
If I can just throw it on that last slide.
Yes, please.
The aspect of the critical habitat, and that's one, and the view sheds, watersheds. Another group you'll want to get in touch with are environmental groups and Fish and Wildlife, because if you plan to do any work in the way of vegetation mitigation, you are likely to need to work with them to get permits, and you'll want to make sure what you have in mind is being done environmentally environmentally sound.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. The fact that you're crafting this plan doesn't mean you have to do an environmental review or a CEQA, California Environmental Quality Control Act report. For sure I got that right. But it doesn't mean you have to do that for this plan. It's not required. However, as David mentioned, you want to engage with the people that know about such things, so that as you're considering projects to mitigate your risk, you want to, if nothing else, become aware of the steps you're going to have to go through to accomplish those goals. At our Occidental governmental stakeholder meeting, we had a couple folks speak about CEQA, and a couple foresters were there actually talking about the CEQA process, so we can all be informed about how that works and how that's important. Carleon, do you want to chime in on any of that? You've got a, you know, your depth of knowledge is immense. I'm sure you can add to that.
Well, any thinking past the CWPP to the grant seeking and grant implementation phase, you know, it used to be pretty easy to get projects on the ground. It's now pretty difficult, and that CEQA, and God help you if you have federal funds too, NEPA requirement is a really important thing to put into your into the mix as you're planning for a project, because CEQA and or NEPA can take a year, 2 years to get through on a complex project. So if you don't have all of the elements in line to start that process, preferably before, but certainly at the first day that you get your grant approval, you can really mess with your project timeline. Because if you don't get CEQA approved, and you finally get CEQA approved, and oh, now it's bird nesting season, so now I can't work because I have to wait till November. So you really need to sort of, as you're thinking about what the projects that we want to do, you really want to work with people who have expertise, who can sort of help you design those timelines. And so you can get some of that early process done before you walk up into trying to, you know, get CEQA going, get property owner permissions going, and get all this stuff when you really need to be starting the implementation, and you can't. So it's a super important thing to think about with all this.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, yesterday I was on the phone with a potential grantor, and he said that to get the grants he was familiar with, he said that, you know, you have to have the CEQA all ready to go, you know, before even asking for the funding. And
Which is a very, very expensive process.
Yes.
So
yeah.
for most of us trying to implement projects in our own backyards somewhere, that's going to be a really heavy lift. And it's a problem. And there's been discussion about how do we make this more functional for communities. But
yeah.
Right now, it's just something that you have to think about and plan for. And can you get a grant just to do the CEQA and then start looking for implementation funding? You know, can you get local funding to do that? So it's a complicated and difficult but really important thing to think about.
Yeah, and you know, it's my understanding that our governor and our state legislatures are aware of this hardship. They're particularly aware of it with our recent history with fires. And, you know, I'm hearing that they're starting to try to craft legislation to make it a little less cumbersome for groups like us, you know, the small local communities that get stuff done at the local level. You know, particularly if you're not doing a huge area, you're doing small areas along roadways, et cetera, that it's got to be easier than it is now. And just to apply for, correct me if I'm wrong, Carly, and you probably know this very well working with the county these days, you know, even to apply for, you know, a categorical exemption and a negative declaration, you know, there's a process, and that costs money. You have to pay the fee to get it through, you know, the planning department at the county. It's a task, so be aware of that. So yeah, so again, part of step 5 is to do your risk assessment. This is probably the most laborious part. Pre-COVID, we would oftentimes gather as a group and sit down and, you know, start to say, okay, you know, what are the risks, etc. Now it's got to be done remotely, which we learned to do both with Grove Street and Occidental. It actually worked pretty well. We just got together, established, you know, what we needed to know, and then sent the information out to the individuals and said, okay, think about it. Tell us what you think by this point in time and get back to us, and then we'll look at it and fold it in. So, Wildfire preparedness is another element of the community risk assessment that gets measured and folded into the plan, with with an emphasis on wildland fire response. I crafted a survey to use for our local fire folks that I send to them, and it says, okay, how many staff, how many type what fire engines, how many, et cetera, to establish that. The other part of wildland or your firefighting resource information is your water supply. That's very important. How much water supply is available for firefighting. And then step 6, we're getting close to the end. You establish your priorities. And then once again, this is a process that works really well in person. You have your big meeting, get everybody together, toss ideas out there. I've watched and learned from Carleon the way she does this. It's phenomenal. The methodology she uses to do this, to get to the, the meat of the material. But with COVID now, the way we ended up doing this, we once again did a similar method, as I mentioned earlier, where we had a Zoom meeting with the group and said, okay, here's what we're trying to do. Go figure out what you think are good projects based on this criteria, write them down, send them to us by this date, and then, we'll come back as a group and review them together, prioritize them, toss some out that maybe don't belong, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, you get together, discuss the results, prioritize them. Once again, the risk assessment tool helps here because it helps you, it helps inform you in terms of setting those priorities. The other thing that we did that works really well is we sent out surveys to the community at large and got their feedback. With Grove Street, they had a really good email list of their community. So we did a bulk email survey to the community, asking them pertinent questions that'll inform the development team in terms of what the community thinks is important, or what their worries are, their concerns. And then those get sifted through, and some of them get aggregated because they're similar. Some of them are unique to the point where they're just this one thought that, well, that's really outside the scope, toss it out, et cetera. So you go through a process, and the process informs you in the next step in terms of prioritizing those. Out in Occidental, we didn't have as good an email list as they did out in the Grove Street area. So we took the mailing list. We have a list of mailing addresses for almost all of Occidental. So we did a postcard mailing saying, hey, we need information about this stuff. Please go to their website and take this survey. So we pointed them to the survey with a postcard mailing to get the information we needed. And the more information you get, the more thorough and robust your final plan will be. And the more information you get, the better it's going to be when the group gets together, that core group, to make those final decisions in terms of what's going in the plan, what's important here. And like I said, we couldn't do it in a big meeting like we used to, face-to-face. So we used those two methodologies to do it remotely. And it seemed to work pretty well. Don't you think, David? I know with you guys it worked really well.
Yes, I was thinking of, you're going to, in this day and age, you're going to need access to the webinar version of Zoom or WebEx or some comparable program, because the old days of standing in front of a big group are on hold. So, and we found that it worked pretty well. It does limit the amount of time that you can think about for a meeting, because as we all see, about an hour and a half into a Zoom meeting, people start to get pretty glazed over. So you got to have your meeting well organized and hit your high points in the first half hour to an hour. And but you can get it done. You can share screen, you can share documents, and it works pretty well.
Yeah, and with that said, I do want to mention that, you know, Fire Safe Sonoma is the county-wide Fire Safe Council, and we're here to help smaller organizations, local Fire Safe Council, councils, you know, as I mentioned earlier, local community groups, whomever you are. If you have a goal of accomplishing something that's comparable to Fire Safe Sonoma's goal of wildland fire safety outreach education and project management, then we're here to help you. We have the Zoom account to do webinars. We help people do that. I just finished 2 webinars for Oakmont groups, and I'm doing one coming up, another webinar for them specifically. We did that for Grove Street, for you guys, a local webinar. So we have the tools, we have constant contact if you need to use that tool to do surveys, etc. And that's what we're here for. We're here to help you. And with Kaylin on board, we have, you know, increased our bandwidth to make this stuff happen. Carleon used to do all this stuff all by herself. I don't know how she did it. You know, now have been doing the lion's share of it, but now we've got Kaylin to help us out. So that's what we're here for, folks. We're the countywide Fire Safe Council. We're here to help you guys, to support you guys. So then step 7, you know, you develop that appendix. You develop the appendix with the list of projects and the, you know, desired mitigation for those. Ideally, you want to have timelines associated with those, as well as likely collaborators and likely funding streams to make those happen. You know, David, you want to toss one out, one of your projects that you guys did or are working on? I like the addressing one. That was one you guys, you know, have identified.
Yeah, that our strategy with the projects, as we're talking, you know, we're talking about needing to get CEQA and other kinds of permits, all of which can cost money. Well, you know, we're starting out and we're scraping around, holding out the tin cup, hoping for contributions. And we selected several projects that really don't require much money at all. Education, public education is a critical role, I think, of the whole mission of the Fire Safe Council. And that can be done at a relatively low cost. You just need to inform yourself and get suitable materials, and you can present that in a webinar format or through hard copy mailings. But the project that we've identified that we really want to get started with is signage, address signage. The county ordinances and state ordinance requires that properties in the wildland urban intermix area all have signs, address signs that are, the numbers are at least 4 inches high, made of a reflective material and on a contrasting background. We've looked into what it would take to get signs for the entire council area. It's not that horribly expensive. We just talked about that at our meeting yesterday, and that's an example of a project you can try to get going. And the important thing is those initial projects will show people that you mean it, that you're really going to do this stuff, that you want to help out, and that can then lead to additional contributions, which you will need to do all of your projects.
Yeah, and then the other, you reminded me, David, that and I want to share this thought with the group. The other thing about having your CWPP is when you go to apply for a grant, a lot of the material that you put into the CWPP is what the grant is asking for. So oftentimes, you know, you're saving yourself a lot of work by just copying and pasting what you've written in your CWPP into the grant application. The other thing I want to mention about projects and grants is that once you've identified the projects, start working on them. Take your high priority projects and craft the plan to get that done with associated budget. Do that now. Don't wait till a grant opportunity comes along and, you know, oh, look, there's a grant coming up and, you know, there's a, you know, 3-week window to apply for it. Yeah, we should do this. And then you have only got 3 weeks to basically write a very thorough and robust business plan to apply for that grant. That's what a grant is. It's a business plan. If you do that work in front of the grant opportunity or the funding opportunity, then, you know, it's really just plug and play. It's just like, yeah, we already know the budget. We know what we need to do. We know what the problem is. We know what resources we need to accomplish it. We know the cost of those resources, and we know how long it's going to take. Boom, you have all the information ahead of time. Plug it in.
One thing that I'll throw in is we're just starting to do this now, but I want to talk to a number of arborist companies, landscaping companies that do the weed whacking and that sort of thing. Talk to them about establishing basically what are needs contracts, which say, when we need these services, you will provide it to us at this predetermined rate. And that way you've got that in your back pocket when you want to start doing your budgets.
Yeah, because it does take a lot of research, from figuring out how, if you're doing a fuels reduction project along a roadway, you need to know, okay, how much is the encroachment permit? How much is traffic control going to cost? You know, how much is the chipper crew going to cost? On and on. You know, and that takes time to research all those. So if you have those already built, you know, your project is already created, then then you just, you tailor it for whatever, grantor or grant application you're going after. That's the way to do it. And then step 8 is the really procedural. You share the draft with your core group, and once they're happy with it, then you share it with, what I like to do is I do it like a legislative approval process where, I give folks, send it to the governmental stakeholders and give them a week for the comment period, and then send it to the community stakeholders and give them a week to comment on it, and then send it out for signature, kind of as a step-by-step. And, as you finalize it, you all need to mutually agree on, the base map. You've already done that ideally long ago in the process. You agree on all the elements of the plan. And then you agree on the priorities and everything. Take your last look at it, have a copy editor look at it, and get it signed. So, and outside the scope of what I call the industry standard, the criteria for the Healthy Forest Act, CWPP, other things you can cover. Determinate age, Jay, that's not really all that relevant. I should just take that off the screen. But as David mentioned, education and outreach effort, it's huge. That's a huge element. Put that in there, not just fuels reduction or structural ignitability, but add outreach and education.
And if I can just on that education, that kind of then loops back into setting the priorities, because we had a lot of the residents here come up with their priorities, but in the grand scheme of things, their little priority or their conception of what their priorities should be don't really tie into what, like, concepts of fire behavior, fire meteorology, traffic management. So if you educate people about what works to mitigate fires and has shown to work over time, that helps them understand the priorities that apply to your council area.
Yeah. So just to summarize, step one is get your champions together, you know, establish a core team, and then have your first big public meeting, inviting your governmental stakeholders, and then have your second big public meeting and invite your community stakeholders. And then memorialize and agree on your community base map, and then start to establish the, the sub elements within the base map. Do your risk assessment, establish your priorities, and then memorialize those priorities and come up with your strategy for mitigating those, and then send it for signature and get her done. And don't just keep it on the shelf. Pull it out at your meetings. Talk about it. Keep it going. Okay, so that's the end of the slideshow. Ellie, do you want to weigh in? I know you probably have some questions, comments.
Who is authorized to sign the CWPP? Is that all? Is that like set up in advance by the?
Yeah. Technically, now I'm glad you asked that question. I should have included it in the presentation. According to the Healthy Forest Act criteria, local government as a signatory, you're required to have state fire sign off on it. And local fire. Those three need to sign off on the document. So that those are your three required signatures. And then you can add more to it if you'd like, but those are the three required signatures. And when they sign, they're not legally binding themselves to the agreement or to the document. They're just, saying that they've read it and they agree with it, at least in concept, and they're supportive of it. It doesn't mean that they have to do the things that are in there. If you have a project of doing fuels reduction 30-foot wide on both sides of a 7-mile road, in there, the fact that your local government signing off on it isn't them saying that they're promising to do that. They're just saying, yeah, we think this is a good idea.
I have one. This is Barbara.
Yes.
From Soda Canyon Fire Safe Council. First of all, thank you for this. This is very informative. We have a 2012 CWPP that desperately needs to be updated. So that's kind of one of our top priorities at this point. One of the questions that I had was regarding, as far as the surveys go, did you find it was more helpful to have surveys sent out or just try and take notes while the Zoom meeting is going on? Which one would you suggest, or maybe both of them, to get priorities and concerns from the community?
Both, because you're going to have different people contributing.
Okay.
With the surveys, you get people who either can't or won't attend a meeting in person or, teleconferencing, but they still have input they want to share. I think it's important to give every opportunity you can to those that you're serving.
Okay.
And the surveys help to do that, but also, I do miss the in-person engagement because it's golly, it just works so well. In a perfect world, I would do all three. I would have in-person meetings. I would offer teleconferencing meetings, and I would certainly, as much as possible, given the resources that you have, do surveys as broadly as you possibly can.
Okay, thank you.
And you have to be really very careful about how you set up virtual meetings where you're trying to get that information in.
Mm-hmm.
I have been very frustrated by that. I kind of felt like, you can't have a long meeting because of Zoom burnout. So it's hard to have the time to provide the backup information that people need to have to understand what you're talking about when you say, what do you think is a community asset? What do you think is a community risk? And then you'll kind of have sort of the conversation in that virtual meeting can kind of go off the rails.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a pretty big challenge in the virtual format. And I'm sure there are people out there who can do a better job at it than I can, but it is a challenge. And so definitely sending out those surveys, I think it would be super helpful.
The questions have to be relevant. They have to be pertinent. You know, that's really key.
Yeah, I think I just kind of would like a kind of a base so that we could create our own, but kind of have a foundation or at least a direction, kind of, because this is all new.
Yeah.
And for some of the people involved. Also, the maps on our 2012 CWPP, with the exception of the ones that need to be updated to show the devastation that was done by the Atlas fire, do you suggest that we still use those old maps? I mean, we're not that old. Maybe we could save some money.
You know, Barbara, have you hooked in? I know that Napa County is updating its countywide plan, I believe.
I think so. That might be the
You
countywide.
really need to pick up with them and see if you can get your map updates done as part of their process.
Oh, okay.
I would ask, because that's how I'm hoping to be able to handle it with our countywide update.
Pepperwood Preserve, they have a pretty good tool too. Go to their website and you can look at some of the modeling that they've been doing. It's pretty good.
Okay.
Jacob.
Sorry if I missed this already, but is there a good way to find a list of active fire safe councils? I know that there's a CAL FIRE, or the CAL FIRE Safe Council website has a map, but I don't know how accurate that is. And associated with that, is there also a good list of more local community wildfire protection plans to look up to make sure work isn't being repeated or anything like that?
What I would like to do is post those on our website and also have the caveat there that says that, you know, if you have formed a fire safe council in Sonoma County, please let us know about it. You know, it just makes sense to me to do that. So
Yeah, that sounds great.
if an entity seeks out information from the California Fire Safe Council, I'm confident, and I've been told this, the California Council will ask them to, you know, check in with us and engage with us, but there's no requirement for that. There's no legal, I think there's a moral requirement or a moral obligation, but there's no requirement to do that. Those are the ones I'm aware of.
It would be super helpful if everybody got in the same room at least once or twice a year, though, because there's a lot of information.
Jacob, I'll tell you, if you go to our website, grovestreetfsc.org, since we just got our CWPP approved, we don't have it up on our website yet. Our web guy, Brady, we're going to ask him to please put our CWPP up on our website, so you'll be able to see it there.
Good dialogue. Cynthia, go ahead. You have a question.
Okay, well, I think my question is very, very basic. I have not really started into the process. All this information makes it seem extremely daunting. But I'm wondering if you have any ideas about just the how to get started with your community. Most of the people that I've talked to in my community are two things. One, very afraid of fire and very much want something to be done, but it's like something to be done, not I'll do it. And also very, well, I live in very much a wooey, and most people kind of look around and say, I just can't imagine what we could possibly do to make our community safe. You know, so there's a certain amount of defeatism. Okay, but I'm sure some people would be interested in getting started, but I'm not sure how to access them.
Yeah, I think the first step is to have that first meeting. And I would say that if you could get even two people from your community to help you, the three of you can get a lot done. And, you know, if you have three of you who are in it for the long haul, that are passionate and are the champions for a small community, I think three people with input from the balance of your community from time to time, I think you can get a lot done. You know, what do you think, Carleon? I mean, we ran Fire Safe Sonoma with just a board of three for a few years when you know, all this wild and fire safety stuff wasn't sexy.
Yeah, it's really going to depend on the community. And some communities are just hard to pull together, but you know, Fire Safe Camp Meeker, really, that was one guy who pushed so hard to get that moving forward that he did get it moving forward, and Fire Safe Camp Meeker is doing a great job.
Our neighborhood, Cynthia, sounds similar to yours. People are scared to death. Everybody's anxious right now. What I've been doing is kind of back it off from talking about fire specifically and just talk about the concept of risk. Because fundamentally, that's what we're dealing with, is how do you manage risk, whether it's in your investments or when you're walking across the street and there's a lot of traffic. I mean, there's always risk to every action. If people love living there, that's the benefit. The cost is the risk of a fire. So you can tell them that what you're trying to do is to come up with a way to manage that risk and mitigate the risk. You're not going to eliminate it. You can never do that. But you can say, this way we can feel more comfortable about living in this place that we love by trying to mitigate risks, by having a community wildfire protection plan and implementing projects. That's my suggestion.
Thank you. Yeah, that sounds good. And how did you access your community for your initial access? My understanding is Camp Meeker, people just kind of walk door to door. And I know they had put, you know, a sign-up sheet in various places. I don't know where. I was thinking I might do something like that.
The way we did it here, I mean, we're very fortunate. Here in Diamond A, we have a recreation center, and we have a very active group that people come to Wednesday barbecues. We have parties. So people know, but without that, what I would suggest is that do you have an email list of everybody around there? And even if you don't, you could put up flyers and go door to door, or you know, just call people that you know, one or two people. And it's the old, you know, if you call one person and they call two people and they each call two, you can kind of do it that way.
You're in Monterey, right?
Rio, yeah.
Yeah, it's a much tougher nut to crack, David, than your neighborhood. I can tell you.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
It's going to be not an easy thing, but yeah, I was just thinking, yeah, what you need to do is go down there and sit out at the barbecue with the fire department.
Yeah. The community bulletin boards are not a bad way to approach it. You know,
And even the online ones, you know, there's Nextdoor for a good neighborhood forum. And also you can go to the assessor's office, and they, you know, if you smile nicely, they will usually give you a list of mailing addresses and addresses of residents if you tell them this is for a community project and you swear you're not going to sell it. And you can get, you know, names and addresses and mailing addresses of the
Send a
residents in
postcard.
your community. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty cheap to send a postcard. I was actually surprised when we did the postcard telling people to take the survey.
This is Fawn. I put a
Yeah,
couple,
go ahead, Fawn.
but I think Friends of Monterey has a pretty broad list.
Mm.
And they're really good about sending out emails, and their communication's pretty clear. So, you know, if you gave them some info and asked them to put it out, I bet that would be a really great first start, even if it was just something like, this is what I'm trying to do. Here's my email address and phone number. You know, they do seem to really have that, you know,
Okay.
community. I think that would be a great place to start.
Okay, thanks.
I appreciate the dialogue and feedback. And, you know, like I keep saying, if there's anything Fire Safe Sonoma can help you guys with, you know, just let us know. That's what we're here for. All right. Well, David,
Thank you.
thanks for sharing, and thanks for helping us out with this. Carleon, you as well. Thank you.
Oh,
I
of
know
course.
you guys are both incredibly busy right now. And Kaylin, thank you so much for you know, helping me pull this off, keeping things moving. So, and then all you guys who attended, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys all attending. So,
Okay, well, thank you.
you're
I
welcome.
Yeah,
appreciate the
thank you.
information. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you.
All right, we'll see you guys.